if we think about the development of individuals as they move into adulthood, relationships are a part of that.
Welcome to Talking About Kids. I'm your host, R. Bradley Snyder, researcher, activist, and author of The Five Simple Truths of Raising Kids. As adolescents transition into adulthood and independence, their needs change. For Black History Month, Talking About Kids is looking at the specific needs of Black youth and young adults. My guest to help me do that is Mavis Sanders. Mavis is a senior research scholar at Child Trends who recently released a wonderfully insightful brief entitled Black Emerging Adults Identify Protective Community Resources that Promote Their Well-Being. You know, influential researchers like Mavis Sanders do not come on Talking About Kids to meet me. They come on to get their research into the hands of people who can put it to use. If you enjoy this episode, please give it a positive review and share it with your friends and colleagues. And now, the interview.
We have two priorities at Child Trends with this research. One is Black family cultural assets, and the other is protective community resources. And I'm sure we'll get into what that is
Right.
later in the conversation. But we started off with a systematic review of the literature on protective community resources. And what we found was that there was a clear gap in the literature, a couple of gaps. One being that even as we understand the importance of the transition from adolescence to adulthood, there wasn't a lot of research that focused on that period of emerging adulthood between, let's say, the ages of 18 and 25. So that was one of the gaps. And another gap was that there wasn't a lot of research that focused on specific populations, even though we
Mm.
know that different populations have different obstacles in navigating transitions to adulthood. And so we're looking specifically at Black youth, adolescents, and emerging adults. And then we saw one other gap, and that gap was that we rely a lot on survey
Mm.
data without really directly talking to the people who we're most interested in learning about. So
Right.
we really wanted to have some research that centered the voices of the participants or the individuals that we were seeking to better understand. And so all of that really led us to sort of saying we need to help fill the research gap around what promotes the well-being of Black emerging adults. And so that led us to partner with Cities United, which is a great organization that is focused on in part on youth leadership for healthy, hopeful, and safe communities. That's their tagline. I probably mixed that up a bit, but a great organization. And so they partner with us so that we can have a conversation with 12 emerging adults from across the country. And we wrote that up in the research brief that
Wonderful.
you're talking about.
And I don't, this is not false praise, but one of the things that keeps me coming back to Child Trends and the different reports is the fact that, I think, in particular over the last couple of years, has really worked to give context to data and research by
Mhm.
elevating the voice of the
Mhm.
subjects of that research, right?
Absolutely.
What a mind-blowing concept to actually get people that the research is about to help us
Right.
understand and explain the research. So
Absolutely.
I really applaud you on that. I
Mhm.
also have to confess my ignorance. I have not been using the term emerging adult. I immediately knew what it meant,
Yes.
but I haven't been using it. But I find it exciting. Can you just for listeners define what is meant by this concept of emerging adult?
Great. I think we can start with what people are familiar with,
Hmm.
right? Most people understand that there's a phase or a stage of development that is childhood,
Hmm.
a stage of development that is adolescence, and then a stage of development that is adulthood. Um, and we have a sense of the physical changes that take place during adolescence, but also the emotional and the mental changes that take place as we try to become more independent.
Mm.
And any parent, any teacher who has dealt with adolescents understand that that can be a very difficult period for both the adults who are engaging with the adolescents, but the adolescents themselves. But as society changes, we note that that period of adolescence is not just, oh, I'm 18, I'm an adult
Right.
now,
Right.
right? Right. So, what we've understood, and Jeffrey Arnett coined the term emerging adult in a major piece that he wrote in 2000, just to describe the very specific challenges that are part of becoming an adult, especially in industrialized and Western societies. And
Hmm.
there's some debate around, is this specific to the US and other industrial nations, or is it more universal and global? Um, and there is a society now for the study of emerging adulthood, but there are some distinctive features, and they speak to the fact that it takes a while now. People are delaying marriage.
Hmm.
They're delaying childbirth and child rearing. They're delaying these things into the 30s. And now the 20s have become this extended period of
Yeah.
exploration. Who am I? You know, what speaks to me in terms of career? How do I think about my career?
Right.
We know that people don't stay on jobs for 30 and 40 years. They may change different jobs in their 20s. All of the sort of process of becoming an adult, taking on what we think of as adult responsibilities, and entering into that adult phase with more confidence and competence is really being relegated to the 20s. And so the emerging adult phase is generally thought to be between 18 and 25 and has been extended to 29.
Yeah.
So when we think of that decade of really exploration, exploring possibilities, dealing with identity development along any number of metrics, and also beginning to take on the responsibilities
Right.
of career development, family development, all of that. Um, that is the stage of emerging adulthood.
And based on your research, you looked at what were these what you called protective community resources, what the field calls protective community resources
Mhm.
that helped these emerging adults succeed during
Mm.
this process or have a better experience while they are emerging adults.
Yes, so they spoke about some things that I think resonate with all of us,
Hmm.
relative to relationships, social connections, advice, mentorship, um, but also places where they can make these kinds of connections, build these relationships with others across generations, but also with themselves. So they talked about the importance of green space and being outdoors.
Mm.
Um, they talked about the importance of wellness centers and mental health supports and cultural
Hmm.
outlets. Also, employment and those individuals that can help them figure out not only where they fit, sort of
Right.
relative to jobs and careers, but how do you begin to even manage and think about managing money and resources and thinking about the future and building financial independence, really wanting support and help in that. Um, and so much of it came down to what we think of in more traditional ways. But I think with this generation of emerging adults, they also want to explore the possibilities of maybe some non-traditional
Hmm.
ways in order to build the kinds of relationships and connections and supports um, that they need to be for their holistic
Well,
well-being.
and so let's just back up just a second on
Mhm,
that because
mhm,
obviously I think that you know, like you and your co-authors, I was really
mhm,
interested in how the young people in your study
mhm,
went about describing these different, community protective community resources and their
mhm,
well-being. But I wanted to point out, and I hope that everybody reads this research brief, which
mhm,
is entitled "Black Emerging Adults Identify Protective Community Resources That Promote Their Well-Being."
mhm,
But before you even talked to the people, the young adults in your study, you had done a literature
mhm,
review. And it
mhm,
had, so what they were talking about was fitting into a larger context of some other
mhm,
studies that had been done before.
mhm,
And one of the, so immediately there was two things that I found really fascinating. One is how the young people in your study seemed to like have a very rich sense of what well-being is,
mhm,
right? It wasn't
mhm,
one dimensional. You
mhm,
divided the responses into kind of four main categories that these
mhm,
research subjects used to define what was meant by well-being. Let's talk about them
mhm,
because I think that the richness of the definition that they are using
mhm,
really affects how we think about these protective factors because it's not just
mhm,
I'm going to give it away, I'm going to let you talk about it, but it's not just economic
mhm.
well-being, right? They're not just saying
Absolutely.
well-being is having enough money to survive. How are they
Mhm.
defining well-being?
Absolutely. And you hit on something that my entire team, which included, Jennifer Winston, who's at the University of South Florida, and Dominique Martinez, who is at Child Trends. We were always so excited after these conversations because what we probably came in with our own conception of well-being. People usually think about that as mental, emotional, and physical. But after talking to these young adults, it was clear that they had a holistic view, as you said. They were talking about, yes, the emotional and the social well being. Like they saw themselves as individuals in community.
Hmm.
And while some of them maintain community in some respects through social media, and remember, we're talking about young people who have gone through a lot,
Yeah.
including the shutdowns related to COVID-19. And how do you stay in community when you're isolated in that way? So social media became a part of that, but now they're craving and they understand and really talk about the importance of in-person kinds of connections. So that was like social emotional. And not surprisingly, romantic partners finding
Mm.
um, close, romantic, intimate relationships was a big part of their notion of their well being. And we can always come back and talk about some of the challenges they
Right.
talked about with that and how we can think about moving forward. They also talked about their physical well being
Right.
and what that meant. And that was about staying healthy physically and that means eating the right kinds of food, having access to the right kinds of food, having access to places to remain active. And how in some of their communities, because of whether we call it supermarket redlining or
Right.
whatever, they don't always have access to the kind of nutritious foods that like they know is important to their sort of physical well-being. They've talked about economic well-being.
Yep.
What does that mean? um, for their own sort of stability, economic stability and independence, but for that of their cohorts.
Hmm.
Again, they really talked about themselves in community. And then lastly, their cultural well-being. And I think that's something that we don't always think about, but there are not a lot of spaces for cultural expression and connection, especially for young people. We have a bad habit in the country of
Right.
sometimes saying, oh, they can be problems, young
Right.
people draw you know, problems, and they were like, "No, we don't draw problems, but we really want opportunities to come together safely, and express joy and to be a part of a cultural exchange, and
Right.
they really wanna share across cultures and just, so they saw cultural well-being as being really important to their overall well-being, and they talked about how they have limited opportunities to really engage in that kind of cultural expression and exchange. And and they interestingly are not just accepting those limitations,
Right.
but thinking about ways that they can curate those opportunities for themselves. And so those were the four areas that were really most prominent in how they talked about well-being. And then they talked about the different people, places, and things,
Yes.
and that's what we think about when we think about, protective community resources that can really promote that, but also those that are not accessible to them right now that they really would like to see in their communities to promote their own well-being and the well-being of others.
Well, let's just pause there for a moment because I
Mhm,
do. I want to like confirm. So, listeners who are familiar with this podcast, when they hear you talk about some of these things that the research first identified, but then the young adults in your study confirmed and talked about, I suspect that they might be thinking, I recognize these as the building blocks of developmentally resilient young children. So like these are some of those things that we see these through lines from, very healthy, early childhood experiences
mhm,
where you've got strong supportive relationships, that
mhm.
strong community that you're talking
Yes,
about.
yes.
And I do want to talk to get in a little bit deeper about what my reading of
Mhm,
the research brief about what when they were talking about economic well-being, it's not
mhm,
just a good job, but it's what happens at that job as well, isn't it,
mhm.
Mavis?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think you're right on both counts. What they're talking about is what we all know is important for individual individuals at all
All
stages of
stages.
development, right? So that's the reason we're so excited about this work and sharing this work with others because I think it can be applied across
Yeah.
context. But it does have to change to be
Yes.
appropriate to the stage of development that we're discussing, right? So we're discussing this emerging adulthood, and yes, they're needing these connections, but they're also needing it to sort of reflect what they're actually
Mhm.
experiencing and to sort of recognize their specific needs within this new stage of development. And so when we talk about things being developmentally appropriate, they need to be developmentally appropriate for this age group.
Yes.
And so it is those coworkers, those relationships with coworkers to sort of help to understand expectations on the job, but also they want to be in conversation about what those expectations should be and how it can the employment or the job or the career can be developed in ways that also reflect the changes in
Mhm.
society, the changes in culture, and to promote well-being, sometimes beyond that the individual, but definitely for themselves, but also for others in the community. So coworkers become really important,
Mhm.
but also conversations with others who may be facing some of the same
Yeah.
challenges. So they talked about having opportunities for adulting
Yeah.
workshops, right? And that adulting just means how do I begin to think about taking on these new responsibilities in the workplace, right? Um, and also making sure that as I take on these responsibilities, I am doing so in a way that builds a better future for me
Hmm.
and also for my community. And they were saying, "Yeah, you can find these things online, but it would be great
Right.
if we could in person have a conversation,
Yeah.
not just someone talking at them, but a conversation where they can ask questions about home ownership, for example, or about how do I um how do I begin to sort of think about a career trajectory, and maybe entrepreneurship is a part of that. How do I begin to build networks
Right.
with people who might be able to help me figure that out? And what does it take to become an entrepreneur? And is home ownership even a possibility for me in my future? Is that something I should even be thinking about? And if pensions aren't around, what is a 401k?
Right.
401k, and is that the best approach? Is there some other alternative? So all of these become questions that, quite frankly, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, no, you wanted a job with benefits, and you sort of went to work, and then you hope, to have some type of retirement or pension to take care of you in your old age. And all of that right now is a big question mark for young people. They don't know
Right.
what to expect. Will Social Security
Right.
even be there? So yeah, it's not just a job. It's not just
Right.
about the job. It's really about economic um, independence and economic viability, and who can they be in conversation
Well, but
with
right,
to sort of help
but
understand
I
that.
inferred from all of that too that first of all, this recognition that there were skills and stuff that they don't know that, and I think I love findings like that because they kind of fly in the face of what I sometimes call cocktail party conversation.
Mhm.
When where young people are vilified as know-it-alls and they don't want to do this and they don't, and
Yeah.
this notion that they're very aware, or the people in your study were very aware that there are
Mhm.
things that they need to learn. And
Absolutely.
they want to be able to learn it in that workplace, which is something that
Yeah,
employers need to I think pay attention to. And they want to learn
absolutely.
it from other people. And boy,
Yes.
young people now when they go and get that starting job, their first several weeks are in front of a screen where they're watching videos of all of
Yes.
the trainings they need to
Yeah,
have, and nobody wants to learn that way, especially
yeah.
this cohort. So employers, if you're listening, invest in in-person training
Yes.
and allow the young
Yes.
people to make mistakes and learn from those mistakes. I'm just throwing
Yes.
that out there. That wasn't in your
Hey,
study, but
no, but absolutely, and also maybe talk to the young people
right.
at your business and ask them what it is they want to know more
Yeah.
about. So let them be involved in identifying areas for professional development, because I think they do know, to your point, what they know and what they don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's, this word that gets used a lot for this generation. You hear entitled, that people they feel like I don't like when I read their words as you report in this study, it doesn't seem entitled. It actually
Mm,
just seems like a recognition of where they are in this world, or rather, where this society put them, and
mhm,
they're just trying to navigate it. And because
mhm.
of that, there's some things that they absolutely need. And I don't think that makes them entitled. I just think it makes them aware.
Mhm.
Um,
And they definitely are coming with values.
yeah,
That was really clear. And so I don't think values make you entitled.
right.
I think what it is that we encourage people to have values. We want young people to have values. That's one of the clear goals of adolescents, to come out
Hmm.
as an individual with values. But to your point, they also value conversations, relationships, mentorship, advisement in context of trust.
Yeah.
And so the young people we were talking to were actually seeking out these intergenerational
Yeah.
conversations, right? So they weren't comfortable being in silos.
No.
They talked about seeking out older individuals, individuals from other generations that they could learn from, right? Because it's scary.
Yeah.
One thing about emerging adulthood, the uncertainty of it all, the 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 possibilities of it. How do you achieve those possibilities? And what if I fail? I
Yeah.
mean, there is a real anxiety that is a part of emerging adulthood right now. Because not only is it a period of instability, but the society is feeling really unstable, you know?
Very.
And so it creates that anxiety. And we know about the mental health issues and so forth that, many individuals who are emerging adults are suffering from. And so absolutely, uh, this needs they need
Mhm.
us. They need parents. They need
And they want
um,
us, which is the other
and they
thing,
want
right?
us.
Which is
Yes,
fantastic.
and
Right.
advisors and mentors and teachers, yes. And teachers came up, by the way, because I know many people in your audience, maybe
Mhm.
educators. Educators came up consistently as protective community resources for them.
Well, and
Yeah,
I do have to remind listeners that we had the privilege of having Noelle Hurd on, and her research on who young people, and in particular who Black emerging adults want as mentors, is really
mhm,
important, I think, to this
that's
discussion.
right,
So,
that's right.
if you're looking to create that successful experience, one that promotes the well-being that these emerging adults need, just remember to ask them who they think their mentor should be. I mean, a
Absolutely,
wonderful, easy way to get the right mentor
that's right.
relationship. Ask them.
That's right. And since we're talking specifically about Black emerging adults, I also want to say that what was surprising to me, given all of the research that says young people are increasingly moving away from religion and faith based kinds of
Hmm.
organizations and stuff, we were surprised. It was, and it was primarily among our Black women, although some of the young Black men also spoke to this, was the importance of the church
Mm,
for them. And not just the church, but sometimes faith based groups where they could connect with folks in these faith based organizations cross generationally, um, but also they're, you know, really take care of themselves spiritually. There was this connection between the social, emotional, and sort of spiritual well-being.
right,
Um, Spiritual didn't come out as separate, but it was clearly a part of that social and like mental well-being. And they were finding that in places again, that's when I said, some of the traditional places that have promoted social and mental well-being, but the church did come up, religious organizations did come up. So again, to those who are listening, um, you know faith-based organizations have a role
right.
to play in also promoting the well-being of Black emerging adults. And so that needs to be a conversation in the faith communities as well. What is the role in promoting well-being
Well,
among these emerging adults?
and let's talk a little bit about your findings, because you
Mhm.
have these kind of four main findings. You've mentioned some of them already, but I want to kind of talk about them specifically here. You've already talked a little bit about how the individuals in your study um, identified that social media had an important role in their life,
Mhm.
but they were recognizing that there
But
was probably a healthier
that's right.
way to approach it.
That's
But
right.
this next one, and boy, this is this is a tough one for me, is the positive romantic relationships. I think of, like, so many of those romantic relationships in the emerging adult years that you talk about. I think of
Yeah.
them as being, maybe at best a double-edged sword, right?
Yes,
Um,
absolutely.
but tell it, but it was important enough that you included it as a finding.
Oh,
These
yeah.
relationships can be stabilizing forces, and you point out that they're
Yes.
social, emotional, and economically stabilizing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It was a surprise for us, but it came up consistently, among our 12.
Mm,
And when you think about it, it makes sense because, you know, emerging adulthood is a time for exploration and figuring out who you are
mm,
and what you want out of life, um, and the possibilities of that. And we already talked about how isolating, um, the shutdowns were for so many. And so the romantic relationships for some were an opportunity to really figure out, you know, who they were and what they wanted out of a relationship and a partnership. If it's even
mm.
something that they did want, but the partnerships and the romantic relationships allowed for that exploration. But for others, it was so important to their emotional and mental well-being. And as we know, when relationships are great, they're great, right?
Right.
And you do feel as though you have a partner on the journey. And that's for them, that's really what they were talking
Okay.
about. A partner, whether it be an emotional partner, but some of them had trauma,
Mm,
early on in relationships, and they have been able to find partners that are supportive and loving, and that creates a certain emotional stability, but sometimes a financial one because now they can merge funds.
okay.
And some of our participants said, now I'm at a place where I can, do this entrepreneurial thing because now I have
Mm,
help with meeting my basic needs with rent and food. We share our resources and it allows me the space to now pursue some other goals that I had. And so we saw how positive, positive, emphasis
right.
there, partnerships and romantic relationships really gave them the support they needed to pursue some of the goals they had for themselves as individuals. And so, again, how are we supporting
Right.
that? How are we as communities supporting young people in understanding what healthy and positive relationships can look like,
Mm,
and making those connections short of you know, social media apps and so forth and so on. And part of that is allowing young people to come together and meet each other in spaces where they are safe, whether it be those cultural venues
right.
that they talked about, whether it be those social venues, and allowing them to meet and congregate as opposed to always, shutting it down. And they talked about, that fact. But I think if we think about the development of individuals as they move into adulthood, relationships are a part of that. And that's when they talked about the church providing at least some guidance in terms of how or faith-based organizations, but if not faith-based organizations, mentors, advisors, who do you go to for relationship advice, especially if maybe you didn't grow up
Right.
in a context where you saw a healthy relationship modeled for you. If you didn't see it modeled for you, it's something that you have to
You
figure
have to
out,
learn it.
and we don't want them to figure it out on their own.
No.
So again, that's where those relationships, those cross-generational relationships come into effect. And it's really important for Black young men and women um, who have to also navigate these relationships in the context of a society that has obstacles. that are related directly to
To
race.
race.
And, so over policing, incarceration of black males and females. There are there are many things that they have to navigate that make that the development of those healthy kind of relationships maybe a little bit more difficult. And so it's definitely something that we have to think about if we want to promote the well-being of Black
Well,
emerging adults.
everything that you wrote about and how you wrote up this research brief talked about the interconnectedness of all of these things that we're talking about, right? So
Yes. Yeah.
these measures of well-being, they're all interconnected. These protective
Hmm.
community resources, they're all
Absolutely.
interconnected.
Yes.
Your third finding we've talked about, it had to do with the employment opportunities, but an aspect of it that we haven't like addressed explicitly that's in your report that you
Hmm.
said was particularly salient to the black males in your study
Hmm.
is
Hmm.
that these employment opportunities also have to be safe.
Hmm.
They have to be opportunities that keep these individuals physically safe. Safe
Hmm.
not just from racism and not just from
Hmm.
stressors, uh, social, emotional, mental stressors, but that safety. So this was a theme in particular in from the black males in your study that they are experiencing physical danger in too many
Hmm.
environments.
Hmm. Absolutely. I think we know the stats that suggest that young black men are at the are have some of the highest rates of homicide
Yeah.
deaths. That when we talk about safe communities, everybody wants that. Some people are, you know, at greater risk of community violence
Hmm.
and violence, um, you know, the pervasive violence, right? And so how do we keep young black men safe
Hmm.
because they are at the greatest risk of being um, in unsafe environments becomes, another area for our attention and our efforts. I mentioned Cities
Hmm.
United. That's part of what they are trying to do. There are other organizations, CM3, that are trying to do that because if you can navigate black men, I think are at some of the greatest risk of violence and harm during that emerging
Right.
adulthood phase and transition. And so thinking seriously about this and acting on this and creating those safe spaces, whether it is um, in employment, you know, communities, and and
And
different
right,
settings.
yeah,
Yeah, we have
and
to
look,
really, focus attention on it.
there are big issues of safety, and but I think that and again, hopefully, longtime listeners to this will recognize that there's some small issues of safety that are a little bit easier to accomplish. And we've done a lot on this podcast with adverse childhood experiences, and we've talked about how you create trauma informed spaces. And one of the keys to having a trauma informed space is to assert the safety of the people who are going to be in that space. Do not take it for granted that the people who are entering in your space know what you have done to make it safe for them. Let them know. It's a small thing, but for people who have experienced trauma, and you mentioned that people in the study have,
Mhm.
knowing what you have done to make your place of employment, your program, your educational opportunity safe. Just letting people know
Yes,
that can go pretty far, actually, to making them
absolutely.
feel better in there.
Absolutely. I think safety is a big thing. Everybody
Yeah,
talks about safety, but safety for whom and how
right.
are we thinking about it? And it really comes down to what you mentioned really early on.
Mm,
Changing narratives about young people. I know that was one of your podcasts earlier. I
right.
had a chance to listen to that. changing narratives about Black men, about Black women, young Black men, that's part of what we hope to be able to accomplish with this research. And also thinking about it, because places that we think of as safe, like college campuses, can be unsafe spaces for even young Black men. Because that sense of, "Do you belong here?" being pulled over by security, like, that is not an uncommon
Right.
experience. And so, yes, our young men wanted to be safe.
Yeah.
Safety was a big priority. And all of these young people, but particularly Black men, wanted to be safe and they wanted to be able to go to spaces and feel safe. So, as you said, being intentional about it, talking about how we're making this safe for you, and also being in conversation. What would make you feel safe in this
Yeah.
context? Right?
Yeah.
Because young people, they don't want to be in environments that are unsafe, but they have great ideas about how you can make it safe for everyone, right? Without pursuing or perpetuating these same narratives about
Right.
who's the problem and who makes everybody else unsafe, right? Black
Exactly.
men have the unfortunate, you know, positioning of being the ones that cause a lack of safety. We have to change that narrative, right? And I think we can.
And and
Yeah,
and because of that distorted narrative, we rarely give consideration to where they might feel unsafe.
that's right.
It's
That's right.
Mavis. Um, again, thank you so much. Our time goes very quickly on talking
Yeah,
about kids.
yeah, absolutely.
Everybody's going to be able to access the links to this study. Thank you so much for helping us think about this very important period in everyone's life and the unique needs of Black males and females in particular. I think it's wonderful and I really appreciate it. And thank you for being a guest.
Thank you so much for inviting me. This has been absolutely a pleasure. I appreciate your questions and your thoughtfulness. And I'm looking forward to a really bright future for all the emerging adults out there. And we just have to do the hard work of making it happen. So thank you so much.
That was Mavis Sanders. For more information about Mavis and her research brief, or to sign up for Child Trends' quarterly newsletter on Black children and families, please visit talkingaboutkids.com. And when you do visit talkingaboutkids.com, please let me know what you think about the podcast. The Talking About Kids theme song is by the Senators. For more of their music, go to thesenatorsmusic.com. And remember, kids are young goats and young humans, and the difference is that young goats are easier to manage.